religionists, in our past units, we looked at some reasons Hinduism didn't travel in a big way to China, nor did Jainism. Hinduism, we saw, was tied to the caste system and Indian culture so closely that it wasn't easily or readily absorbed into alien cultures. Jainism is so ascetic that, in fact, well, the Jain priests couldn't even travel across the deserts or the Himalayan mountains wearing nothing. So Buddhism travels along the Silk Road to China, filtering in mostly through merchants and wandering monks, and in some cases the missions of kings. In particular, there's a little-known Buddhist empire, the Kushana Empire, that inhabits lands that are now Muslim, Afghanistan, Pakistan, large parts of Uzbekistan and the like. And so that empire was officially Buddhist, and hence the giant Bamyan Buddhas we have in Gandhara and the like, modern-day Kandahar, and named after Alexander the Great. So it was an empire filled with Scythian and Greek Buddhists. And the Buddha image will develop there and in Mathura, and what we'll see is Mahayana, the liberal form of Buddhism we might recall from the last unit, established in the north of Asia, central to East Asia, in fact. And so when Buddhism enters China, we already know well that China has established religions of Confucianism and Taoism. And we call China the land of three religions because, well, in the Chinese religious mind, if there is such a thing, one can be in all three religions at the same time. They don't have conflicting claims like Jews, Christians, and Muslims do. So we'll see China drastically transformed by Buddhism, but it goes the other way too. Buddhism will vastly transform Chinese culture also. With the advent of Buddhism, China gets spices from India, and all the Szechuan and other delicacies now are available to the Chinese palate. And so when we're looking at this Mahayana Buddhism as opposed to the Theravada conservative traditions of South and Southeast Asia, we see a very much more liberal Buddhism. Some things, in fact, the Buddha would not have approved of, such as making statues of himself. He said, don't do that. I'm not the focus. My message is the focus. And so for a couple hundred years, Buddhists refused to make images of the Buddha. But then the Greeks, with Alexander the Great, who famous for their images, couldn't help themselves. And so Buddhism becomes known as a religion of images in China, and the kind of Buddhism that will dominate is going to be this larger division, the Mahayana, the great vehicle of Buddhism, of our three Theravada conservatives, Mahayana liberals, and Tantric Vajrayanans, if you will, the diamond vehicle we call it, which will emphasize the body, and the body as a means to nirvana and final awakening. So let's take a look. How does this Mahayana Buddhism appear? We can see some things in the Vimalakirti Sutra, for example, where this Mahayana Sutra, these are all said to be by the Buddha for the most part, although they're all fabrications of later ages, and hence the conservative Buddhists do not acknowledge their authority. But in the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra, we see in chapter 9, a goddess discussing things with the Buddha's foremost disciple intellectually, Shariputra, who claims that a woman cannot become awakened or enlightened. And so in the middle of their discourse, the goddess swaps bodies with Shariputra and says, well, who's on their way to nirvana now? In particular, this Mahayana Buddhism was more popular with merchants. The early Mahasangika, we think they're the original of the 18 sects that will rise up into this vast Mahayana Buddhism, the largest in numbers of adherents for sure, that these guys started handling money and even having, sexual intercourse with partners and the like. And so this Mahayana Buddhism appeals even more arguably to women, but also merchants, because it becomes a type of Buddhism you can practice in your home quite easily. And so it expands the reach of the Buddhist tradition, more and more inclusive, and thus more flexible as well. Hence, This Mahayana Buddhism was capable of absorbing so many Confucian and Taoist elements into it, while some conservative Theravada monks made it to China, and there was some of that in China. Those largely died out. And so it's important to realize that this Mahayana division of our three, being more expansive and liberal, sees itself as the great vehicle, and the Theravada and other conservatives are the Hinayana, an insult for sure, don't call them that, because they only really allow for the life of a monk in the formal aspects of the tradition. In the thinking of all Mahayana Buddhist traditions as well, we may recall the thought of that great thinker Nagarjuna, who, influenced by the discovery of the zero in India, develops a whole philosophy around zero-ness, or shunyata, wrongly translated in my opinion as emptiness, or nothingness, but frankly, zero is what it's all about. And we remember the Buddha's own religion is about the middle way, and if we think of the zero, it is in the middle of all the positive and negative integers, and thus a hub for infinity. So for Nagarjuna, it's infinite in all directions, this world, and every moment, in fact, can be divided infinitely. There are no atomic time-space units like the conservative Buddhist thought, in his opinion. So then for the Madhyamika school of Nagarjuna, among the two big Mahayana schools, the Yogacara, Yoga Praxis school, which emphasizes consciousness, and the zeroness tradition of Nagarjuna, we see these emerge as the most influential philosophies of North, Central, and East Asia. For Nagarjuna taught not truth versus falsehood. For him, everything is true to some degree, but in a concealing way. So all words conceal because, first of all, they separate subjects from objects. And you can't separate a subject from its object. And please see the unit on Indian Buddhism to find out more about those arguments. And then this Yogacara school, the Yoga Praxis school, says, well, reality can't exist apart from a knower. The known must be known by a knower, and thus nothing could be known without a consciousness. Hence, the Yogacara, Yoga Praxis school, founded by Asanga, posit 8 layers of consciousness, not different consciousnesses. The 5 sense consciousnesses we all know so well, seeing, smelling, etc., but also a 6th, the mano-vijnana, that collates all those senses into a world picture. The early Buddhists only posited these 6, but the Yogacara go further and even outdo Freud with their idea that there is another ego level, manas, and that is where the James Powell resides, is at that level, and that is the target. The enemy is that ego consciousness. Finally, there is the alaya vijnana, the basal consciousness, and that, they say, is what reincarnates through time. So those are a few features of Mahayana Buddhism with which we should be familiar to understand what happens in China and Tibet. And it should be said that basal consciousness then is what reincarnates and also contains, like a seedbed in a garden, all your past karma from prior lifetimes, believe it or not, and that's what's going to carry you into the next lifetime. Even though these yoga praxis fellows agree with the Madhyamika that in the end, consciousness is part of a feedback loop, Buddha's original idea, in fact, and the consciousness itself has no self-existence, but being dependent on what the knower knows, it too is empty of self-existence. So those two schools simply really disagree about the reality of consciousness. Is it a complete fake, as the Madhyamika will maintain, so to speak? It's true, concealingly, but ultimately it is not. And for the Yogacara, for there to be awakening of a consciousness, then there must be, well, a real consciousness for that to happen. And so for the yoga praxis as well, my James Powell ego is just a projection onto nothingness. It is illusory, and yet it also exists as a reality, even though what I know, those things are all fake or imputed, we could say, projected onto an empty screen. So as Buddhism enters China, there's a big problem the Chinese have with even translating Buddhist terminology. We can see in the West this was a problem also. The Sanskrit word dharma in Buddhism means ultimate reality, but it also means ethics and behavior. It also refers to the alleged infinitesimal time-space units that make up existence, rejected by those Madhyamika we just discussed. But nevertheless, the dharmas of early Buddhism, all of these things go into this word. And so initially Taoists thought the Buddha was a reincarnation of Lhasa in India. And for the Chinese consciousness, as I understand it, India, the heavenly kingdom, is filled with phantasmagorical imagery and ideas that were alien to the Chinese civilization prior to the advent of Buddhism. Even in the West, early Buddhologists, as we call them, translated this word dharma as law, because the closest thing they could think of was kind of God's eternal law. And we can see finally in today's modern American and European Buddhology, we did what the Chinese eventually did in the transmission period that took some 3-4 centuries to develop just terminology to think about Buddhism. And so the Sanskrit term returns in China as it has done in modern Buddhology. No one translates that term. Buddhism is its own thing, if you will. And so it's important to remember that when Buddhism enters China, it is not a civilizing force. Chinese civilization is one of our 4 seats of ancient civilization. So Buddhism mixes and mingles in this transmission period, and in the process is influenced by Taoism and influences Taoism as well, and Confucianism to some degree, though Confucianists will be somewhat oppositional to Buddhism. Now Buddhism will be a civilizing force, and well, the old northern barbarians, as the Chinese know them, the non-Han Chinese, the Mongols, Manchu, and Tibetans. Their Buddhism will bring literature, government, all kinds of things that come with civilizations, just as Christianity will likewise civilize Russians, Germans, and other European peoples. So St. Cyril and Methodius developed the Russian alphabet, and likewise Buddhist scholars bring the Devanagari script to Tibet and these other cultures. So Buddhism will shape these cultures, but be shaped by Chinese civilization. As Buddhism enters China, it brings with it the things that appeal to people around the planet about Buddhism, notably the role for women. We saw in the Indian Buddhism that those early beggaresses, nuns, bad translation, sang hymns of praise that they could leave that jerk behind and get an education and be free of household duty. And so in patriarchal Confucian culture where the woman is to be obedient to her husband, Buddhism was a kind of proto-women's liberation. Not that things were completely equal there, for sure. As Buddhism becomes established by the 600s-700s, it's big, very popular, a lot of money, kind of outclasses the Confucian and Taoist institutions. And so we see the emergence of great Chinese culture heroes like Xuanzang. Master Xuanzang traveled for 16 years on his way to the Kushana Empire I mentioned, and also down into India itself, collecting the Chinese Buddhist sutras that had existed at that time. When Master Xuanzang comes back, that's when we get new original terminology for Buddhism, and that is when Dharma is no longer known as the Tao, but by this time, as he calls it, Daruma, or Dharma. So in this peak period of Buddhism in China, the monks called the government coffers their inexhaustible treasury. And we can see the only time in China where an empress reigned is the Empress Wu, very devoutly Buddhist. She gave millions to build fantastic structures, monasteries for the Buddhists, including the famous mirrored hall of Fasan, one of the ancient wonders of the world. And in it, mirrors surrounded the people entering this dome-like structure, and in the middle is a Buddha with a candle, and when you're in there, you see your infinite self like a hologram, as Fasan believed the universe to be, reflected with a Buddha nature image in the middle of your own image in the mirrors in this hall. And so we can ask ourselves, would we like to see a lot of our tax dollars go to pay for, as the Confucian guys are going to kind of see it, guys to meditate on their navels and not be very economically productive? So her period represents a time where Buddhism is a powerhouse in China, as it will continue to be, although we will also see by the end of, well, the 9th century, 843 to 845, Emperor Wuzong is told by Taoist advisors that if he eliminates black from China, he can attain immortality, and black refers to Buddhism. Likewise, the Confucian scholars were none too thrilled then about this family and world-denying religion as far as they were concerned. So we can see in China, there were all the Buddhisms from India and local ones developed in China that didn't exist anywhere else really. But by this persecution of Emperor Wuzong, many of these are gone, as are tens of thousands of monasteries and some 30,000 monks forced back into the labor market. So the fancy Buddhisms, if you will disappear, but two will remain mostly influential. And let's just look at the first of these, the Qingde, or as it's called usually in the West, the Pure Land school of Buddhism. In fact, goes back to India as Sukhavati school, or we can really better translate it, not Pure Land, but Happiness Buddhism. So again, they're all Mahayana schools, and the postponement of one's own awakening in favor of enlightening others is one of the principal ethical drives in Mahayana Buddhism, the ethics of the Bodhisattva. We saw this with the figure of Guan Yin as she's appropriated from Taoist sources into Buddhism. And so what of this happiness Buddhism? What's it all about? Infinite light Buddha is the focus, and when I talk to other Buddhists and I mention the Pure Land, happiness Buddhism, often people laugh, and it's not fair. It really is Buddhism. The idea is that for the poor peasant, and the persecution didn't affect the religious faith of the peasants, it lives on, and that's why this happiness Buddhism lives on as a kind of pie in the sky when you die kind of Buddhism. So it is thought that the infinite light Buddha, Amitabha, or immeasurable light, was once a human named Dharmakara, appearance of the Dharma. And he made a vow to attain full awakening and then save all beings. When he attained to the superconsciousness the Mahayanists believe are existent for the millions and myriads of cosmic Buddhas that the conservatives reject, and that Dharmakara becomes the Buddha of the West, welcoming the dying peasant into his loving arms. There it said the peasant can train in Buddhism and thus themselves speedily make their way to Buddhahood also. And in that Pure Land, the descriptions are of lotus blossoms falling from the heavens, lapis lazuli floors, beryllium pillars, and I think you get the picture. It's pretty nice in the Pure Land of happiness Buddhism. And so among the Pure Land teachings, certainly, especially I'm thinking of Shinran, a happiness or Pure Land scholar of Japan, his view was that the scholars and the learned and the monks are actually farther away from awakening and nirvana than is the sinful, poor person. And why is this? The sinful or poor person has less of an ego than these important types. So we can call Amitabha really this faith a faith in the grace of a power that is other than the individual, and when this other power merges with my self-power, then that for me is awakening. And it can happen here and now in this world. It need not take death if I connect my consciousness with infinite light Buddha. Then I see this very world as the Pure Land. And in that sense, this is not a kind of Protestant or Christian Buddhism. It is still Buddhism, but granted, a very new kind of Buddhism in the world. So this Dhyana school, well, gets its origins, of course, they all claim to go back to the original Buddha, but specifically in China, it's the emergence of this monk, Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma travels from Pakistan. Rumor or legend has it he had red hair and blue eyes, and why, Chinese kind of thought he was a demon. In fact, believe it or not, he meditated for 9 years, staring at a cave wall, meditating so focusedly that he drills holes into the wall with his eyes. That cave exists to this day. One thing Bodhidharma noticed in China, though, and this again, the practice of Tai Chi and Taoist emphasis on kinetic movements as aspects of the religion. Bodhidharma says, well, our Buddhist monks just don't move around enough. And thus he incorporates martial arts into Buddhism. It doesn't exist for the Tibetans, and the conservative Buddhists just think it's madness. Buddha advised not harming even insects, so kung fu fighting is out. And so the Chan or Zen guys will tell you meditation's the critical factor, not book learning and scholarship. Words are a golden chain, but a chain nonetheless. So they call themselves a tradition outside the scriptures and a tradition of the silence of the Buddha. That's where they take this tradition. And so not many know that martial arts traditions have philosophical traditions that accompany them. The ninja follow the tantric Buddhism. The samurai follow the Zen guys. The Shaolin are also Chan or Zen Buddhists. And Kung Fu is the empty fist. The fist part's Taoist, but the Kong, emptiness, that is a Buddhist admixture. And so among the interesting practices of the Chan school is the use of the koan in Japanese or kung-an in Chinese. The kung-an was originally a Confucian idea of a legal case where something's publicly debated by two opponents and then a judgment is reached. But in Chan Buddhism we see, in fact, a very different use of the kung-an or koan. The koan is meant to jolt people out of thinking in words. And so the famous series of questions by a disciple to Master Unman, a few of them are like this. The disciple asks Master Unman, what is Buddha? And he says, well, Buddha is a shit cleaning stick. Well, you can imagine the conservative Theravadins and even the Tibetan Tantrans, they don't like that much. What's meant by that? Well, it's meant first of all to jolt the hearer out of the idea that Buddha is some kind of transcendental figure like those happiness Buddhists believe, or that Buddha is any kind of God, or that there is anything not sacred, if you will, or awakened. And thus the shit cleaning stick was used by peasants to push the poop off the old Chinese roads. Another student asks Master Unman, does a dog have a Buddha nature? And Master Unman responds with, woof! Well, that doesn't make any sense to normal people. But, again, Master Unman in the koan, which is a one-on-one intuitional exchange between teacher and student, it is intuitional, not logical or rational. So rational arguments just don't hold much sway for these Zen or Chan kind of thinkers. Of course, the most famous of these koans is, if you see the Buddha on the road, kill him. We can't see anyone saying that about Muhammad, Krishna, or Jesus. But again, in this sense, kill the Buddha in your mind, the Buddha as anything other than the here and now presentness of our world. And in this sense, Taoism has been at work shaping and molding Buddhist tradition because the Taoists share a similar view about language and about hierarchical thinking, frankly. So in this, the Buddhists and the Taoists do disagree with the Confucian guys, but They're very distinct traditions, even though they interweave so nicely. So in subsequent centuries, we'll see a merger as well of Buddhism with Confucian thought that, well, we call the influence of Buddhism on Confucian thought Neo-Confucianism. So that's how much Buddhist logic of the two schools, Madhyamaka, Yogacara, we mentioned earlier, influence the core thinking even of Confucianism itself. Buddhism will transform China just as the Jewish sect that swept Europe 2,000 years ago transforms the Greek and Roman cultures also. So there's an eerie parallel from east to the west of the Eurasian